They called him the Devil of New York, a man who owned half the city and buried the other half 6 feet under. Marcus Valero didn't negotiate with debts. He collected them in blood, bones, and broken lives. His tattooed fingers had ended more men than the electric chair, and his private estate was where loose ends came to disappear. But that night, in his wood-paneled study surrounded by armed soldiers and the sharp scent of expensive cigars, he didn't want another corpse. He wanted entertainment. Welcome to Story Lens TV, where every story reveals something hidden, something powerful, something you never saw coming. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you love stories that grab you by the throat and don't let go, hit that like button and subscribe, because you're not going to believe where this one takes you. Marcus Valero stared at the exhausted young woman they dragged into his study. Still in her wrinkled nanny uniform, her hands raw from 14 hours of scrubbing dishes and wiping tears. Her messy bun was falling apart, soft tendrils of light brown hair framing a face that looked far too tired for 26. Liora Marchetti. She stood trembling, but her shoulders were squared. Her eyes, those tired, fierce eyes, darted to the ornate chair in the corner. Sitting there, bound with thick rope and a black hood over his head, was an old man. His tied hands were shaking violently. Marcus reached out with one tattooed hand and slowly pulled the hood away, letting the fabric fall to the floor like a death sentence. The old man's face was bruised, weathered, terrified. Giovanni Marchetti, 70 years old and broken in every way that mattered. Papa! The word tore from Leora's throat like a prayer and a scream all at once. Hello, Piccola! The old man whispered. Blood dried at the corner of his mouth. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't smile. He simply walked to the massive oak table in the center of the room and began setting up a chessboard, each piece placed with the casual precision of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Black pieces on his side, white pieces facing the empty chair across from him. He turned to Liora, his sharp jawline catching the firelight, those calculating eyes missing absolutely nothing. His slicked-back hair and open-collared suit revealed the intricate tattoos snaking up his neck, symbols of every territory he owned, every enemy he'd buried. I'll make this very simple, little bird, Marcus said, his voice smooth as silk wrapped around a knife. He gestured to the chessboard with those tattooed fingers that had strangled men twice his size. Your father owes me $2 million. I've been trying to collect for 3 years, but apparently, the great Giovanni Marchetti is worth less than the cardboard box he sleeps in. Leora's fists clenched at her sides, knuckles going white. But tonight, Marcus continued, pulling out the chair and sitting down like a king on a throne. I'm feeling generous. So here's the deal, you sit down. You play me. 1 game. Classical rules. He leaned forward, and the room seemed to grow colder. If you can checkmate me, if you can actually beat me at the only thing in this world I've ever loved, I'll let your father go. Free. Clean slate. You both walk out of here with money to start over. He paused, letting the silence stretch like a blade against skin. But if you lose, Marcus smiled then, and it was the smile of a wolf that had already tasted blood. If you lose, your father dies right here, right now, with a bullet in his skull. And you become mine, my property. What that means, I'll leave to your imagination. The armed men lining the walls shifted their weight. The fire crackled. Giovanni let out a broken sob. She can't! The old man screamed, struggling against his restraints. She hasn't played in years. This is murder. Just kill me and let her go. But Liora wasn't looking at her father anymore. She was staring at the chessboard, at the White Queen, at the 64 squares that had once been her entire world before addiction and poverty had stolen everything. She looked at Marcus Valero, this tattooed monster who thought he'd already won, who thought a nanny was just a terrified girl who'd crumble under pressure. And then, with a voice steadier than her racing heartbeat, she said, I'll play. Marcus's eyes lit up with genuine pleasure, the first real emotion anyone in that room had seen from him in 5 years. Excellent, he whispered, gesturing to the chair. Sit down, Miss Marchetti. Let's see if the daughter of the Phantom of Milan inherited anything worth saving. Leora's breath caught in her chest. He knew. He knew who her father really was. She walked to the table on legs that felt like they might give out at any second. She sat down across from the Devil of New York, the chessboard between them like a battlefield, her father weeping behind her, armed men watching every move. Marcus smiled that cold, terrible smile. "You may have the first move," he said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never lost anything that mattered. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that before gambling and grief had destroyed him, Liora Marchetti had been the greatest chess mind in all of Europe. A grandmaster at 19. A prodigy who could play 20 games simultaneously while blindfolded. The Phantom of Milan. And he had taught his daughter everything. Every strategy. Every trap. Every sacrifice. Every killing sequence. Marcus Valero thought he was playing a frightened nanny. He had no idea what was sitting across from him. Liora reached out with a trembling hand, her delicate fingers hovering over the white pieces. Then, with the ghost of her father's voice in her memory, "When they underestimate you, Piccola, that's when you strike." She moved her first pawn forward. The game had begun, and only one of them would survive it. The pawn slid across the board with a soft click against polished wood. E4. King's pawn to the 4th rank. The most classical opening in chess history, played by masters for 500 years. Simple, direct, aggressive. Marcus Valero leaned back in his chair, studying not the board but Leora's face. Those tired eyes that had been scrubbing dishes and changing diapers for 8 months were now focused with the intensity of a sniper lining up a kill shot. He moved his own pawn forward. E5, the symmetrical response. And so it began. But to understand how Liora Marchetti, exhausted nanny, invisible servant, forgotten woman, came to be sitting across from the Devil of New York playing for her father's life, you have to go back. Back to that same night, just hours earlier, when the world was still normal and death was still something that happened to other people. The November rain had been hammering against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Rossi penthouse on the Upper East Side for 3 straight hours, 30 stories above the chaos of Manhattan. Liora had pressed her forehead against the cool glass at exactly 11:47 p.m. She remembered checking the kitchen clock, watching the city lights blur through the downpour like watercolor paint running down canvas. Her feet ached. God, how they ached. She'd been awake since 5 a.m., when little Sophia had crawled into her tiny room off the kitchen, crying about a nightmare. 17 hours on her feet. Breakfast, school drop-off, grocery shopping, lunch prep, homework supervision, dinner party service, dishwashing. The life of a live-in nanny for a wealthy Manhattan family. Invisible. Forgotten. A ghost who folded laundry and wiped tears. Liora was 26, though exhaustion had carved lines around her eyes that made her look closer to 35. She'd been working for the Rossi family for 8 months. 8 months of 12 to 16-hour days, of smiling when Mrs. Rossi criticized her cooking, of pretending not to hear when Mr. Rossi screamed into his phone in Italian about shipments and territory disputes. Every 2 weeks, when her pathetic paycheck hit her account, Liora sent 70% of it to a homeless shelter in Queens. Not as a donation, as payment for a specific bed, a specific locker, for a specific broken old man who slept there most nights. Liora Marchetti, once the greatest chess mind in Europe, now just another drunk who smelled like cheap whiskey and defeat. 7-year-old Sophia was finally asleep, thank God, after 3 stories and 2 glasses of water and 1 check under the bed for monsters. Mrs. Rossi was at another one of her charity events, the 3rd this week, wearing a dress that cost more than Liora made in 6 months. Mr. Rossi had left hours ago in a black SUV with tinted windows, barking orders into his phone. Leora's hands were raw from washing dishes after their dinner party. 12 guests, for courses, crystal wine glasses that cost more than her monthly salary each. Her knuckles were red and cracked, and one of her fingernails had torn while scrubbing a roasting pan. She hadn't heard the private elevator doors open behind her. Hadn't heard the heavy footsteps crossing the marble floor. The penthouse had been silent except for the rain and her own exhausted breathing. Then the voice came, smooth and dangerous and utterly calm. "Step away from the window, Miss Marchetti. We need to talk about your father." Leora's heart had stopped. Actually stopped. She spun around, and there he was. Marcus Valero. She'd seen him twice before, once 3 months ago, once 6 weeks ago. Always with Mr. Rossi, always in quiet conversation in the study with the doors closed. She'd brought them coffee, and Marcus had looked at her exactly once. His calculating eyes scanning her face like a machine processing data, before dismissing her with a slight nod. No thank you. No acknowledgement. Just that one look that had made her feel like prey being evaluated by a predator who decided she wasn't worth the effort to kill. But now he was standing in the Rossi living room at midnight, and he wasn't alone. For men flanked him, all wearing dark suits, all with the coiled tension of trained killers. One had a visible bulge under his jacket. A gun, Liora realized with creeping horror. They'd positioned themselves between her and every exit. The elevator, the stairs, even the balcony. Marcus himself was devastatingly handsome in the way that dangerous things often are. A viper with perfect scales, a blade with a razor edge. Early 30s, maybe. Dark hair slicked back with precision. Sharp jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. And the tattoos, intricate designs snaking up his neck from beneath his collar, covering his hands, disappearing under his sleeves. Not prison tattoos. Art. Expensive art. The kind that took hundreds of hours and tens of thousands of dollars. His voice was calm, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. "Miss Marchetti," he said again, walking toward her with the casual confidence of someone who owned every room he entered. "I said step away from the window." Leora's legs moved before her brain caught up. She stumbled sideways, putting the leather couch between herself and this man who'd invaded the penthouse like he owned it. "Who are you?" she whispered, though she already knew. Everyone in the building knew, in that unspoken way that prey always knows when a predator is near. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you know who I am, but let me clarify something for you, since you've been living here for 8 months and apparently still don't understand the situation." He gestured around the penthouse, the Italian marble floors, the original paintings, the custom furniture. "The Rossi family works for me. This penthouse? Mine. The cars in the garage? Mine. Those charity events Mrs. Rossi attends 3 nights a week? Front operations for my business interests." Leora's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She'd suspected. God, of course she'd suspected. But she'd told herself it was paranoia, that she was just exhausted, that wealthy people were always shady, but that didn't mean. "You're looking pale, Miss Marchetti," Marcus observed. "Should I get you some water?" "Oh wait, that's your job, isn't it? Fetching things for people who don't see you as human." One of his men chuckled. Marcus silenced him with a look. 3 hours ago," Marcus continued, pulling out his phone, "at approximately 8:43 p.m., you went down to the parking garage to retrieve a toy that Sophia had left in Mrs. Rossi's car. A stuffed rabbit, I believe. Purple. Very loved." Leora's mouth went dry. How did he know that? How could he possibly? Marcus swiped his phone screen and turned it toward her. Security camera footage. Black and white. The parking garage. And there was Liora, clearly visible, standing frozen at the entrance to the private elevator bay, staring through a crack in a partially open door. And on the other side of that door, barely visible but unmistakable, Mr. Rossi standing over a man on his knees, a gun pressed to the back of the man's head. If you're feeling that knot in your stomach right now, that's exactly what Liora felt. That moment when you realize you've seen something you can never unsee, that your life just divided into before and after. If that's hitting you hard, go ahead and hit that like button, because the story's about to get so much darker. "You watched for 17 seconds, Marcus said, his voice flat. "Then you grabbed the rabbit and ran back to the elevator. You didn't scream, didn't call the police. You gave Sophia her toy, put her to bed, and washed dishes like nothing happened." Liora couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "That tells me 2 things, Marcus continued, pocketing his phone. "1, you're smart. You understand that calling the police would have signed your death warrant. 2, you're a problem. Because I can't have loose ends, Miss Marchetti. I can't have nannies who witness executions and then go about their day pretending they didn't see anything. That kind of thing has a way of coming back to haunt you. I won't say anything, Liora managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I swear. I didn't see anything. I don't know anything. Don't lie to me, Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp as a whip crack. You saw exactly what you saw. And yes, you would say something. Maybe not today, maybe not next month. But eventually, in a confessional to a friend, in a moment of guilt or fear or anger, you talk. They always do. He stepped closer, and Liora backed against the window, the cold glass pressing against her spine. But then, Marcus said, and something changed in his voice, a note of curiosity creeping in. I had my people look into you. Background check. Financial records. Family history. And imagine my surprise when I discovered who you really are. Liora's heart hammered against her ribs. No, he couldn't know. There was no way. Liora Marchetti, Marcus said, savoring each syllable like expensive wine. Daughter of Giovanni Marchetti. Born in Milan. Moved to New York 8 years ago. Your father is currently residing at, let me check my notes, the St. Michael's Shelter in Queens. Bed 47. He's been there on and off for 3 years. Tears burned in Liora's eyes. And that's when it clicked for me, Marcus continued. Giovanni Marchetti. That name sounded familiar. So I did some research. Giovanni, the Phantom Marchetti. Grandmaster. European champion. One of the most brilliant chess minds of his generation. A man who could play 20 simultaneous games blindfolded and win 19 of them. He tilted his head, studying her like a specimen under glass. Your father owes my organization $2 million, Miss Marchetti. Underground chess gambling in Atlantic City. He borrowed money he couldn't repay, then disappeared into the streets before we could collect. We've been looking for him for 3 years. Homeless, drunk, worthless. Marcus smiled then, and it was the smile of a man who'd just drawn a winning hand. But now, he said softly, I have something much better than money. I have his daughter. The room tilted. Liora grabbed the window frame to keep from falling. My father hasn't gambled in months, she said desperately. He's been sober, he's been clean, Marcus pulled out his phone again. Different images this time. Security footage from a different location. A dingy basement room with card tables and chessboards. And there, unmistakable even in the grainy footage, Giovanni Marchetti, her father, slumped in a chair with a bottle beside him, moving chess pieces with shaking hands while men in suits counted money. The timestamp read, 6 days ago. Liora felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, that had broken so many times over the years that there wasn't much left to shatter. This was something deeper. Hope, maybe. The foolish, desperate hope that her father had finally turned a corner. That this time would be different, that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild their lives. He lied to you, Marcus said, not unkindly. Again. They always do, addicts. It's what they're best at. Please, Liora whispered. Please, just let me go. I'll disappear. I'll leave New York tonight. You'll never see me again. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus interrupted. You're going to come with me, quietly, without a scene. My men will escort you to the elevator and we'll take a drive. If you cooperate, I'll bring your father somewhere safe where we can have a conversation. If you refuse, or if you scream, or if you do anything other than exactly what I tell you. He leaned in close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive like everything else about him. I will kill you right here, he whispered. Right now. Then I'll find your father, and I'll make him watch a video of what I did to you before I put a bullet in his brain. Do you understand me? Liora nodded, tears streaming down her face. Good girl, Marcus said, stepping back. Dmitri, get her coat. It's cold outside. The next 15 minutes passed in a blur of terror and surreal displacement. One of Marcus's men, Dmitri apparently, had retrieved her threadbare winter coat from the closet. Another had disabled the security cameras in the elevator. They'd escorted her down to the parking garage where 3 black SUVs waited, engines running, windows tinted so dark they looked like solid obsidian. Marcus had gestured to the middle vehicle. "After you." Liora had climbed in, her legs moving on autopilot. Marcus had slid in beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He'd placed his gun on his lap. Not threatening, just casual, like it was a phone or a wallet. A reminder of the power dynamic. A reminder that she was completely, utterly helpless. They'd driven for 2 hours into the darkness beyond the city. Liora had watched through the window as Manhattan's lights gave way to suburbs, then to rural highways, then to narrow roads cutting through dense forest. The Hudson Valley, she'd guessed. Far enough from the city that no one would hear her scream. When they'd finally arrived, Liora had stared in disbelief at the estate sprawling before them. Massive iron gates, guard towers, a mansion on a hill that looked like it belonged in a European horror film. All stone and Gothic architecture and floor-to-ceiling windows that glowed with warm light. "Welcome to my home," Marcus had said with dark amusement. "Try not to bleed on the carpets. They're Persian." Inside, the decor had been a study in contradictions that made Liora's head spin. Original Renaissance paintings hung next to displays of antique weapons. Swords, daggers, guns mounted behind glass. A library filled with leather-bound first editions stood adjacent to a room crammed with surveillance monitors showing every angle of the property. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. Chopin, Liora had recognized dimly. Nocturne number 2. Marcus had led her through a maze of corridors, his men flanking them like an honor guard, until they'd reached a heavy wooden door. He'd pushed it open, revealing the study where, hours later, Liora would play the game of her life. Wood-paneled walls, a fireplace with a roaring fire, bookshelves filled with chess texts and strategy guides. And there, in the center of the room, tied to an ornate chair with thick rope, Giovanni Marchetti. Her father looked worse than she'd ever seen him. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. His clothes were torn and filthy. His gray beard was matted with what looked like dried blood. He'd aged a decade in the week since she'd last seen him at the shelter, pressing money into his shaking hands and pretending not to smell the alcohol on his breath. "Papa!" The scream had torn from Liora's throat before she could stop it. She'd lunged forward, but Marcus's hand had caught her arm. Not roughly, just firmly enough to stop her momentum. "Go ahead," he'd said. "Say hello. You have 2 minutes." Liora had run to her father, dropping to her knees beside his chair. "Papa! Oh God, Papa! What did they do to you?" Giovanni had wept, deep, racking sobs that shook his whole body. "I'm sorry, Piccola. I'm so sorry. I lied to you. I promised I was done gambling, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't." "It's okay," Liora had whispered, though it wasn't okay. Nothing was okay. "It's okay, Papa. I'm here now, we'll figure this out." "How touching," Marcus had said from behind them. "A father-daughter reunion. Makes me almost nostalgic for family." He'd walked to the massive oak table that dominated one side of the study and begun setting up a chessboard, each piece placed with meticulous care, black on one side, white on the other. "Now," Marcus had said, turning to face them with that terrible smile, "let's discuss terms." And that's how Liora Marchetti, 26-year-old nanny with raw hands and broken dreams, had found herself sitting across from a mob boss, playing chess for her father's life. The rules were simple, Marcus had explained. 1 game, classical rules, no time limit. If Liora won, if she somehow managed to checkmate one of the most dangerous men in New York, both she and Giovanni would go free with a car and $10,000 to start over. If Marcus won, Giovanni would die immediately, a bullet to the brain, and Liora would become Marcus's property. What exactly that meant, Marcus had left ominously vague, but his smile had suggested nothing good. "She can't," Giovanni had screamed, struggling against his restraints until the rope cut into his wrists. "She hasn't played in years. This is murder. Just kill me and let her go." But Liora had stared at the chessboard, at those 64 squares that had once been her entire universe, and she'd remembered. She'd been 8 years old, sitting at their kitchen table in their little apartment in Milan. Papa had still been sober then, still teaching, still believing that chess could save them. He'd moved a white knight, and she'd studied the board with fierce concentration, and when she'd found the right response, a quiet pawn move that Papa hadn't seen coming, he'd laughed with pure delight. "You have the gift, Piccola," he'd said, ruffling her hair. "You see the board like poetry, like music. Most people see chess as war, but you and me, we see beauty." The memory had hurt worse than any punch. "Why?" Liora had asked Marcus, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Why not just kill us? Or collect the money some other way? Why this?" Marcus's answer had been chilling in its honesty. "I'm bored," he'd said simply. "I've been bored for years. Money? I have more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Power? I control half of New York. Fear? Everyone who matters is already afraid of me. But chess." His eyes had lit up with something that looked almost like joy. "Chess is the only thing that ever made sense to me. The only pure thing in this entire rotten world. And I want to see if the daughter of the Phantom of Milan inherited anything worth saving." Liora's eyes had widened. "You know who my father was?" "Giovanni Marchetti." Marcus had recited like he was reading from a biography. "The Phantom of Milan. Grandmaster at 19. Destroyed Kasparov's protege in the 1994 European Championships. Could play 20 simultaneous games blindfolded and win them all. Prodigy. A legend. And then 20 years ago you just vanished from the chess world. I've always wondered why." Giovanni's face had crumbled. "Because I destroyed everything. That's why." And Liora had realized, with sinking horror, that this was a trap. Marcus knew her father had been a genius. He expected that Liora might have inherited some talent. But he still thought he'd win. He thought he was playing a frightened girl who dabbled in chess as a child. He had no idea. "I'll play," Liora had said, and she'd been surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Marcus's eyes had lit up with genuine pleasure. The first real emotion she'd seen from him all night. "Excellent," he'd whispered. "Victor, bring coffee. This might take a while." A man in an expensive suit. Late 40s, cold eyes, the look of someone who'd done terrible things and slept soundly, had nodded and left the room. Liora had sat down across from Marcus Valero, the chessboard between them like a battlefield. Her father weeping in his chair behind her, armed men lining the walls like statues. Marcus had offered her the white pieces. Ladies first. And Liora had moved her king's pawn forward, e4. The beginning of everything. Now, 3 moves in, she was already analyzing the position 6 moves deep. Marcus had responded with e5, the open game. Knight to f3. Knight to c6. She developed her bishop to c4, the Italian game, one of the oldest openings in chess, dating back to the 16th century. Marcus had smiled at that. Classical training. Your father taught you well. The first 10 moves had been textbook. Liora had played a king's Indian defense, solid and careful, the kind of opening that gave nothing away. Marcus had countered with an aggressive pawn structure, testing her knowledge, probing for weaknesses. But as they'd played, Marcus had talked. Psychological warfare disguised as casual conversation. "Tell me," he'd said, moving his bishop to g5, pinning her knight. "How does the daughter of a chess grandmaster end up scrubbing toilets for a mafia family? That's quite a fall from grace." Liora had answered minimally, trying to concentrate, but Marcus had been relentless. "8 years ago you were in Italy," he'd continued, studying the board while he talked, multitasking effortlessly. "Now you're in Queens. Your father went from grandmaster to homeless drunk. What happened, Miss Marchetti? What broke your family so completely?" She'd moved her knight, not answering. But the memories had come anyway. She'd been 12 years old, sitting in the audience at a tournament in Venice, one of the fancy ones with corporate sponsors and television cameras. Papa had been playing in the quarterfinals, representing Italy against a Russian master. She'd watched him stumble to the table, watched him knock over his water glass, watched the officials whisper to each other with concern. He'd played anyway, brilliant for the first 15 moves, And then suddenly, catastrophically, he'd blundered. Hung his queen. Just left it sitting there to be captured. The crowd had gasped. The Russian had looked confused, checking the board 3 times to make sure it wasn't a trap. The officials had dragged Papa away, and Liora had run after him, finding him in the bathroom, vomiting, reeking of cheap vodka. "I'm sorry," he'd sobbed. The same words he still said today. "I'm sorry, Piccola. I'm so sorry. Your father taught you well," Marcus had said, pulling Liora back to the present. She'd realized she'd just executed a Botvinnik maneuver, a complex peace trade that looked like it gave away material but actually improved her position. That's classical training. Very disciplined. Giovanni had been watching silently, tears streaming down his face, recognizing his own strategies in his daughter's moves. This was what he'd taught her during their good years, before the alcohol had taken everything. By move 15, something had changed in Marcus's expression. Amusement had given way to focus. He'd sat forward, studying the board more carefully, and Liora had realized with a thrill of terror and hope that he'd underestimated her. She wasn't just competent. She was genuinely skilled. Victor, Marcus's captain, had returned with coffee at that point, watching the game for a moment before leaning down to whisper something in Marcus's ear. Marcus had waved him away impatiently. "Not now. Can't you see we're busy?" Victor's jaw had tightened. Just a flash of something that might have been resentment before his face had smoothed into professional neutrality. He'd nodded and retreated to the corner. Liora filed that away. Tension in the ranks. Something to maybe exploit later if she got desperate. Move 20 had been the turning point. Liora had executed a complex peace trade that forced Marcus into a defensive position, trading her knight and bishop for his rook and pawn, simplifying the position in a way that favored her remaining pieces. The armed men in the room had exchanged glances. Their boss, the Devil of New York, the man who never lost, was being pushed around the board by a nanny in a wrinkled uniform. Marcus had laughed then, and it hadn't been cruel or mocking. It had been delighted. "You've been hiding, haven't you?" he'd said, his eyes bright. "All these years scrubbing floors and changing diapers, when you could have been playing. When you could have been brilliant." Liora had met his eyes across the board. "Chess doesn't pay rent," she'd said, her voice bitter. "Chess doesn't buy groceries. Chess doesn't feed a father who spent every dollar we had on whiskey and card games." The words had surprised her. She hadn't meant to say them, hadn't meant to let the resentment show. But there it was, 8 years of suppressed anger bleeding out in the middle of a life-or-death game. Giovanni had flinched like she'd slapped him. "Liora, Not now, Papa." She'd cut him off, moving her bishop with more force than necessary. "We're playing chess." Marcus had studied her with new interest. "You resent him," he'd observed. "Good. Resentment is honest. Hate, love, those are both pure emotions. It's indifference that's dangerous." "I love him," Liora had said quietly, moving a pawn. "That doesn't mean I can't see what he destroyed." The game had continued. 3 hours passed. Neither player had a decisive advantage, but Liora was holding her own against a man who had clearly played thousands of games, who had studied chess like a master martial artist studies fighting. Finally, Marcus had called for a break. 20 minutes, he'd announced. "Victor, get her something to eat, and show her to a bathroom. We might be here all night." A female guard, Liora hadn't even noticed her until then, had escorted her to a bathroom down the hall. The woman had given her water and a sandwich without a word, standing outside the door like a sentinel. In the bathroom, Liora had stared at herself in the mirror. Still in her nanny uniform, the stupid black dress with the white apron that made her look like a Victorian servant. Her hair falling out of its bun, eyes wild with exhaustion and fear and adrenaline. She'd splashed cold water on her face and whispered to her reflection, "Think, Liora. Think like he taught you. Find the pattern. There's always a pattern." When they'd resumed, something had shifted. Move 30 approached, and Liora had begun transitioning into the endgame, deliberately trading pieces, simplifying the position, transforming the complex middle game into something cleaner and more calculable. She'd remembered Papa teaching her this when she was 16. After they'd fled to America, living in that shabby apartment in Queens that smelled like mildew and defeat. He'd been mostly sober that year, the last good year before the bottom fell out completely. In the endgame, Piccola, he'd said, setting up positions on their cheap plastic chess set. Every move is life or death. No mistakes. No mercy. You calculate until you see checkmate, and then you execute. It's the most honest phase of chess. No tricks. No tactics. Just pure calculation. Now, across from Marcus Valero, Liora had forced the game into exactly that territory: patient, grinding, positional warfare. The kind of chess that required ice water in your veins and the ability to calculate 20 moves ahead. Marcus had realized what she was doing. Your father taught you this, he'd said. It wasn't a question. He taught me everything, Liora had admitted, and suddenly the words had just kept coming. Before the drinking got bad. Before we lost our house in Milan. Before Mama died. He taught me every day after school. Chess was our language. The only way we could really talk to each other. Giovanni had been listening with fresh tears falling. Because this was the first time Liora had spoken about her mother in years. The first time she'd acknowledged those memories instead of burying them. Marcus had asked, his voice gentler than it had been all night. How did she die? Leora's hand had frozen over a pawn. The question had hit her like a physical blow. House fire, she'd whispered, moving the piece mechanically. 8 years ago in Italy. Papa was at a tournament. I was at school. Mama was home alone. The room had gone silent except for the crackling fireplace. The fire marshal ruled it an accident. Liora had continued, her voice hollow. Faulty wiring, they said. But Papa never believed it. He said men had come to our house before he left for the tournament. Men asking about money he owed. He said. She'd swallowed hard. He said they killed her to send him a message. And that's when Giovanni had broken. The dam he'd been holding back for 8 years had shattered. It wasn't an accident, he'd shouted, struggling against his restraints, the rope cutting into his wrists. Liora, you need to know the truth. I didn't gamble that money away. I was forced to throw a match. Forced by Antonio Valero. Marcus Valero's entire body had gone rigid. Every muscle locked. His hand froze over the bishop he'd been about to move. What? He'd said, his voice deadly quiet. Did you just say? Giovanni had looked directly at Marcus with something like defiance burning through the fear. Your uncle, Giovanni had spat. Antonio Valero. 8 years ago he controlled the underground chess circuit in Milan. He was running illegal tournaments, taking bets, laundering money. And I was stupid enough to play in them because I was desperate, because I owed money to loan sharks, because I thought I could win my way out. He'd laughed bitterly. Antonio kidnapped my wife. Your men broke into our house while I was training for a championship. They took Maria, Leora's mother. And they left me a message. Play in Antonio's tournament. Lose in the semifinals to the Chinese representative. Antonio had bet millions on the outcome. If I won, Maria would die. Leora's world had stopped. The chess pieces had blurred in her vision. But I couldn't do it. Giovanni had continued, his voice breaking. I couldn't disgrace the game like that. I couldn't throw a match even to save her. So I played to win. And I won. And Antonio. His voice had dropped to a whisper. Antonio kept his promise. He burned down our house with Maria inside. Marcus's voice had been so quiet it was almost inaudible. And the $2 million debt? Giovanni had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Fiction. Blood money. Antonio fabricated it to destroy me. He wanted to ruin my reputation, make me untouchable in the chess world, force me to run. When I tried to tell people the truth, he had evidence planted. Forged gambling receipts, fake loan documents. Everyone thought I was just another degenerate gambler making excuses. He'd looked at Marcus with something like pity. When Antonio died and you inherited his operations, you inherited his lies. You've been collecting a debt that never existed. Hunting a man for a crime that was forced on him. If you're still with us, if your heart is racing right now, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. because what happens next is going to change everything for these three people trapped in this room together. Marcus had stood up so abruptly his chair had scraped backward across the floor. He'd walked to the window, his back to everyone, his tattooed hands clenched into fists. The guards had looked nervous. Liora had seen them exchange glances, hands moving slightly closer to their weapons. They'd never seen their boss lose composure like this. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus had spoken, his voice carefully controlled. Antonio Valero was a monster, he'd said to the window, to the darkness beyond. He raised me in basements and locked rooms, beat me until I couldn't walk, starved me for days as punishment for imagined disrespect. The only thing in those rooms was a chess set. He turned around slowly. When Antonio died, murdered by the Bratva in a territory dispute, I thought I was free. I thought I could be something different. But apparently, I've been carrying out his murders for him, collecting debts for his crimes. He'd looked at Liora, and for the first time, she'd seen something human in his eyes, something that might have been shame. "You don't owe me anything," Marcus had said. "Your father doesn't owe me anything. This game is over. Victor, cut him loose." "No." Liora had surprised herself. The word had come out firm, clear. Marcus had stared at her. "What?" "No," she'd repeated, moving her rook across the board with a decisive click. "We finished this. You said chess is the only thing that makes sense to you? Then let's finish it. For my mother. For the truth. For everyone Antonio Valero destroyed." Tears had been streaming down her face, but her hand had been steady. "I'm one game away from getting my father out of here alive," she'd said. "I'm not stopping now." Marcus had studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his face. "As you wish," he'd said finally, returning to his seat. "Victor, the coffee's cold. Bring fresh." Victor had hesitated just a fraction of a second, before nodding and leaving. The game had changed then. It was no longer a battle for survival. It had become something else. A ritual, a memorial, a way of honoring the dead by doing the one pure thing left in a corrupted world. They'd played with new intensity. Move 40, move 50, and slowly, position by position, trading pieces with surgical precision, Liora had begun to win. Her rooks had doubled on the 7th rank, the 2nd rank in chess terminology, one square away from Marcus's back row. Her king had marched up the board like an invading general. Marcus's pieces had been pushed back, cramped, struggling to breathe. It was beautiful in its brutality. Every move a calculation, every sacrifice deliberate. This was chess the way her father had taught her, not as a game, but as truth expressed through wood and ivory. Marcus had played brilliantly in defense, finding the only moves that delayed the inevitable, but they'd both known how this would end. Liora was winning. The daughter of the Phantom of Milan was beating the Devil of New York at the only thing he'd ever loved. And in the corner, Viktor Kozlov watched with cold eyes, his phone buzzing in his pocket with messages he didn't answer, making calculations of his own. Because while everyone was focused on the chessboard, Victor was playing a different game entirely. One that was about to turn this night even more deadly than anyone imagined. Move 55 arrived like the slow inevitability of dawn after a long, dark night. Liora had a significant advantage now. An extra pawn that didn't sound like much to anyone who didn't understand chess, but to masters it was the difference between life and death. Her king had marched up the board into enemy territory. Her rooks dominated the 7th rank like twin cannons, and Marcus's pieces were cramped, suffocating, running out of breathing room. Marcus was defending brilliantly, finding the only moves that delayed the inevitable, the kind of defensive chess that required genius-level calculation, but they both knew how this would end. Every exchange of pieces tightened the noose. Every pawn push was another step toward the gallows. It was 4 in the morning when Marcus finally called another break. "We've been playing for 7 hours," he said, his voice hoarse. The tattoos on his neck seemed darker in the firelight, shadows pooling in the intricate designs. 2 hours. Rest. Eat. Then we finish this. Victor stepped forward. "Boss, we have the morning shipment meeting at." "Cancel it," Marcus said without looking at him. Cancel everything. Nothing matters except this game. Victor's jaw had tightened again. That same flash of resentment, deeper this time. Of course, boss. Whatever you say. A female guard escorted Liora to a bedroom on the second floor. It was surprisingly beautiful. Four-poster bed with silk sheets, windows overlooking the forest, an attached bathroom with marble surfaces. The kind of room that belonged in a luxury hotel, not a mob boss's fortress. You have 2 hours, the guard said. There's food on the dresser. Don't try to leave. There are men outside your door, and the windows are alarmed. Then she was alone. Liora sat on the edge of the bed, her body screaming with exhaustion, but her mind was still running chess variations. 7 moves to checkmate. Maybe 8 if Marcus found the most stubborn defense. She'd calculated it all during the last 5 moves, seeing the pattern emerge like a mathematical proof clicking into place. She was going to win. After everything. After 8 years of scrubbing floors and hiding her gifts. After watching her father destroy himself. After losing her mother to men like Antonio Valero. She was going to win. But she couldn't sleep. The adrenaline was too high, the stakes too overwhelming. She moved to the window, watching as dawn broke over the forest beyond the estate. Pink and orange light filtering through the trees, birds beginning their morning songs. The world waking up completely indifferent to the life and death game being played inside these walls. A soft knock on the door made her jump. She turned, expecting the guard. Instead, Marcus Valero stepped into the room, alone, no guards flanking him. He was holding 2 glasses of whiskey. Liora tensed, backing against the window. Have you come to kill me before I can win? Marcus shook his head, a sad smile crossing his face. No, I came to apologize. He held up the glasses. Drink with me? I think we've earned it. They sat by the window and Marcus began to talk. Really talk, without the psychological warfare, without the cruel jokes. Just honest words from a man who'd spent his entire life lying. He told her about being 9 years old, locked in a basement room for 3 days as punishment because he'd asked Antonio where his mother was. The room had been empty except for a chess set, an old wooden set with pieces that were chipped and worn, and a book. Chess. 100 Master Games, by someone named Tartakower. I taught myself, Marcus said, staring into his whiskey like it held answers. Played both sides, white against black, moving back and forth across the board, talking to myself like I had an opponent. Kept me sane. Or maybe it drove me insane. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. He'd memorized entire games from that book, studied patterns, developed strategies, and when Antonio finally let him out, starving, filthy, half-mad, Marcus had challenged him to a game. I was 9 years old, and I beat him, Marcus said. Not because I was better, because Antonio didn't care about chess. He only cared about power, and chess is the one place where power doesn't matter. Only truth matters. When Antonio had died 5 years ago, murdered by the Bratva in a territory dispute that had left 7 men dead in a warehouse, Marcus had been 25 years old. Everyone expected him to fold, to let the empire collapse. Instead, he'd taken over with ruthless efficiency, consolidating power, eliminating threats, building something bigger than Antonio ever had. But I never forgot those basement games, Marcus said quietly. Chess is the only pure thing I've ever known. Everything else, the money, the power, the fear, it's all corruption. All of it. But chess? When I sit down at that board, I'm not the devil of New York. I'm just someone trying to find beauty in 64 squares. Liora watched him as he spoke. This man who'd kidnapped her father and forced her into a life-or-death game. And she saw something she hadn't expected to see. He was broken too, just like her father, just like her. Then why are you a monster? She asked softly. If you know chess is pure, if you understand beauty, why do you hurt people? Why do you kill? Marcus's answer was so honest it hurt. Because it's all I was taught, he said. When you grow up in hell, Liora, you become the devil. Not because you want to, but because you don't know how to be anything else. Every man who raised me taught me that kindness is weakness, that mercy gets you killed, that the only way to survive is to be more brutal than everyone else. He looked at her, and his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 7-hour chess game. "I don't know how to be human," he admitted. "I've forgotten. Or maybe I never learned." "You could choose differently now," Liora said, the words surprising her. "Right now, you could let us go. You could stop collecting Antonio's debts." "You could. Could I?" Marcus laughed, but it was sad, hollow. "Men like me don't get redemption, Liora. We get bullets or prison cells. That's how these stories end. There's no third option." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, drinking whiskey that burned like truth going down. Finally, Marcus asked, "When you win, and you will win, we both know it, where will you go?" Liora realized she didn't have an answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "Away from here. Maybe back to Italy. Maybe nowhere. I've spent so long just surviving, just keeping my head down and making it through each day. I forgot what it means to actually live. To have dreams bigger than making rent." Marcus stood to leave, pausing at the door with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "you remind me of who I could have been. If I'd had a father who taught me with love instead of violence. If someone had given me chess as a gift instead of as a prison cell toy." Then he was gone, and Liora sat alone with her whiskey and her thoughts, her heart a war between hatred for what he'd done and something dangerously close to understanding why he'd done it. 2 hours later, they resumed the game. Move 65 arrived with the weight of finality. Liora had maneuvered her pieces into a devastating formation, a textbook king and rook endgame that would be studied in chess books if anyone ever saw this game. Her rooks were doubled on the 7th rank, a formation so powerful it had a nickname among grandmasters, "Pigs on the 7th." Her king had marched up to the 6th rank, a battering ram ready to deliver the killing blow. Marcus's king was trapped on the back rank, his pieces scattered and ineffective, his options narrowing with every move. The endgame had become a slow execution. Every move tightened the noose. Every piece that came off the board made his position more hopeless. But Marcus was playing brilliantly in defense, finding the only moves that delayed checkmate, forcing Liora to prove she could finish. In chess, this was called making your opponent earn it, refusing to resign, making them demonstrate their mastery all the way to the bitter end. Giovanni watched with tears streaming down his face, because he recognized the position. This was a pattern he'd taught Liora when she was 16, practicing endgames in their queen's apartment. He'd called it the executioner's dance, methodical, brutal, inevitable. "Piccola," he whispered. "You're doing it. You're actually going to win." But Viktor Kozlov was watching too, and his expression was wrong. He kept glancing at his phone, typing messages, stepping out of the room to make quiet calls. The other guards were getting nervous. Liora could see them exchanging looks, hands drifting closer to weapons. Something was very wrong. Move 70 arrived like thunder before lightning. Liora had a forced checkmate in 7 moves. She could see the entire sequence as clearly as if it were written in the air. Queen here, rook there, king marches forward, and then the final blow. 7 moves. Inevitable, mathematical, beautiful. Her hand hovered over her queen, ready to begin the final assault. Marcus saw it too. His face showed something Liora hadn't seen before. Not fear, not anger, but acceptance. Maybe even relief. "You're brilliant," he said quietly. "Your father taught you well. I've played thousands of games, and this," he gestured at the board, "this is art." Giovanni sobbed openly. "Piccola, you did it. You saved us. You beat the devil of New York." Liora's fingers touched the white queen, ready to move it to G7, the killing square, the beginning of the end. The study doors exploded open. Viktor Kozlov burst in with 6 heavily armed men who definitely weren't Marcus's regular guards. These were professionals, tactical gear, automatic weapons, the dead-eyed look of mercenaries who killed for money and slept soundly. Victor's gun was drawn, aimed directly at Marcus's head. "Don't move, boss," Victor said, his voice cold as a morgue. "This has been a long time coming." Marcus froze, his hands still resting on the edge of the chessboard. His eyes went to Victor, then to the mercenaries, calculating odds, running scenarios. "Victor," he said, voice deadly calm. "What the hell is this?" Victor smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd been waiting years for this moment. "This is a change in management," he said. "Did you really think I'd let you audit the books? Did you think I wouldn't notice you were 3 days away from discovering what I've been moving?" The truth hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You've been stealing from me. Embezzling millions," Victor confirmed cheerfully. "For 2 years. Feeding information to the Bratva. Planning this takeover. And you know what? You made it so easy. Sitting here for 7 hours playing chess with a nanny while your empire crumbled. While I positioned mercenaries, turned your guards, and got ready to take everything you built." His mercenaries had moved with professional efficiency, disarming the 2 regular guards in the study, forcing them to kneel, securing all exits. "I'll make this quick," Victor said, aiming at Marcus's forehead. "Then I'll tell the Bratva it was a family dispute. Tragic, but necessary. They'll accept me as the new boss, and your loyal men outside? They'll fall in line or fall dead." Liora's mind was racing. After everything, after the truth about her mother, after the game, after 7 hours of brilliant chess, they were going to die anyway. Murdered by a traitor during what should have been the final move. Unless she looked at the chessboard, at the position, at the queen under her fingers. Then she looked at Marcus, at the way his body language had shifted when Victor entered. His hand had moved slightly, touching something under the table's edge. Something he'd been very careful not to draw attention to. A button. Or a latch. Something. And suddenly Liora understood what she had to do. If you're still here, if your heart is pounding right now wondering how they'll survive this, do something for me. Hit that like button. Because what happens next is why you watch stories like this. For the moment when the underdog finds one last move nobody saw coming. Time seemed to slow down, the way it does in chess when you see the brilliant sacrifice that changes everything. Liora made her decision in a split second. Instead of screaming, instead of begging, instead of freezing in terror like Victor expected, she deliberately moved her queen. Not to G7, not to the checkmate square that would end the game. She moved it to E5. An exposed, unprotected, stupid square that hung the queen where Marcus's remaining bishop could capture it. A blunder so obvious that even a beginner would spot it. Marcus's eyes snapped to hers. For one heartbeat, she saw confusion. Then understanding. Then something that might have been respect. He knew. He understood immediately that this wasn't a mistake. Victor laughed. A harsh, cruel sound. Choking under pressure? After 7 hours of perfect play, you hang your queen? Pathetic. He shook his head mockingly. Marcus, your taste in entertainment is as weak as your security. While Victor was distracted by her blunder, Liora slid her foot under the table, searching, and found it. A small raised button on the underside. She pressed it hard, heard the faintest click. Somewhere in the mansion, a silent alarm was triggering. Marcus's loyal guards outside were being alerted. But they needed time. 60 seconds, maybe 2 minutes for the guards to respond. Marcus played along perfectly, his voice bitter. You ruined my game with your incompetence, Victor. At least let me take her queen before you kill me. One last pleasure. He reached for the board, but as his hand crossed the center, he deliberately knocked over several pieces. The knight, the rook, pawns scattering across the table. Clumsy, Victor sneered. Just like. But in the chaos of falling pieces, Marcus's hand had found the hidden compartment in the table's edge. A click. A concealed drawer springing open on his side. 2 loaded pistols. Everything happened in 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Marcus grabbed one gun and shot the nearest mercenary in the throat before the man could raise his weapon. He simultaneously kicked his chair backward and flipped the massive oak chess table forward as a shield. 500 pounds of solid would crashing over, sending chess pieces flying like shrapnel, creating instant cover. Liora grabbed Giovanni's chair and tipped him backward behind the overturned table just as Victor's mercenaries opened fire. The study exploded into violence. Bullets tore through wood, shattered the mirror over the fireplace into 1,000 glittering shards, ripped chunks from the leather-bound books, sent the chandelier swaying. The sound was deafening. Not like movies, but a physical assault that made Liora's ears ring. Marcus fired from behind the table, controlled bursts, and another mercenary dropped. But there were too many. Victor had brought professionals with automatic weapons, and they were spreading out, taking positions, preparing to flank. Liora saw the second pistol on the floor where it had fallen when Marcus flipped the table. She'd never fired a gun in her life. She'd never even held one. "Liora!" Marcus shouted over the gunfire, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The positions! Call positions like chess notation." And suddenly she understood. Her mind, trained for 17 years to see chessboards, to calculate patterns, to think spatially, could map the room like a game. "Knight to g4!" she screamed, meaning a guard was flanking from the left corridor, using chess coordinates. Marcus pivoted without looking, fired twice. The flanking guard dropped. "Rook to b2!" she called. 2 mercenaries advancing from the doorway. Marcus adjusted his position, keeping them pinned with covering fire. Her chess genius had become a combat strategy guide. Outside, Marcus's panic alarm had reached his loyal guards. She heard shouting, more gunfire from the corridors, boots pounding on marble floors. They were coming. But Victor's mercenaries were professionals. They'd positioned men throughout the mansion. The battle became three-dimensional, inside the study, in the hallways, throughout the estate. Victor, realizing his coup was failing, his carefully laid plans crumbling, made a desperate move. He lunged forward with shocking speed, grabbed Liora by her hair, and yanked her up from behind the table. Pain exploded across her scalp. His gun pressed against her temple, cold metal against bone. "Everybody stop!" Victor roared. "Stop shooting or I blow her brains out." The room froze. Marcus was half standing, gun aimed, but he couldn't take the shot. Victor was using Liora as a human shield, his body positioned perfectly behind hers. "No!" Giovanni screamed, struggling against his restraints until rope cut bloody lines into his wrists. "Take me! Kill me! Leave her alone!" Victor backed toward the door, dragging Liora with him. "Here's the new plan, Marcus. Your men let me walk out of here or I kill her. Then you can spend whatever time you have left explaining to yourself why you sacrificed her for pride." Marcus's hand was steady, the gun unwavering, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that never showed emotion, were desperate. For the first time since Liora had met him, she saw genuine fear in Marcus Valero's face. Not fear for himself, fear for her. "Don't," Marcus said, and his voice was almost pleading. "Victor, you can have everything. The territory, the money, all of it. Just let her go." "No deal," Victor said, dragging Liora another step toward the door. "She's my insurance." Liora's mind was still running chess variations even as her scalp screamed with pain. Victor was 3 steps from the door. Marcus couldn't take the shot without hitting her. Giovanni was tied up, helpless. The mercenaries were holding position, waiting for Victor's signal. She remembered something Papa had taught her when she was 13, practicing tactical puzzles. When trapped, piccola, when you have no winning moves visible, what do? You sacrifice everything for the checkmate, Papa. Exactly. You create the winning move by force. Liora met Marcus's eyes across the destroyed study, across the battlefield littered with chess pieces and bullet casings. She mouthed one word: trust. Then she threw her head backward with every ounce of strength she had, slamming her skull into Victor's nose. The cartilage crunched with a sound like breaking celery. Victor's head snapped back. Blood exploded across his face. His grip loosened for one split second. Liora dropped straight down, letting her legs give out completely, becoming dead weight falling toward the floor. Marcus didn't hesitate. 3 shots. Center mass. Professional. Precise. Victor's body crashed backward against the doorframe, his expensive suit blooming with dark red flowers. Shock froze on his face, the expression of a man who'd planned everything except for the possibility that a nanny would headbutt him. He slid down the wall like a puppet with cut strings, dead before he hit the floor. The remaining mercenaries saw their leader dead, saw Marcus's loyal guards flooding the corridors with overwhelming force, and made the calculation all professionals make. They threw down their weapons. "We surrender! We surrender!" But in the chaos of the final seconds, one of Victor's mercenaries, wounded in the shoulder, bleeding, desperate, fired a wild burst from his automatic weapon as he fell. The bullets stitched across the wall, across the overturned table, across the space where Marcus was standing. Marcus staggered. His hand went to his abdomen. When he pulled it away, it was covered in blood. "No!" Liora screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She was crawling across the debris-strewn floor before she realized she was moving. Across bullet casings and chess pieces, across shattered glass and splintered wood. Marcus dropped to his knees. The gun clattered from his hand. Liora reached him, pressed her hands desperately against the wound. Blood. So much blood. Seeping between her fingers, warm and terrifying. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice fierce. "Don't you dare die, Marcus Valero. Don't you dare." Marcus looked at her, blood on his lips, and incredibly, impossibly, he smiled. "You didn't checkmate me," he whispered, each word costing him. "So technically, you're still mine. Then stay alive, you bastard." Liora sobbed, pressing harder against the wound, trying to hold his life inside his body through sheer force of will. "Because I'm not finished with you yet." Giovanni had finally been freed by one of Marcus's guards. He crawled to them, his old body moving faster than it had in years. "Ambulance!" he was shouting. "Someone call an ambulance!" Marcus's loyal guards secured the mansion with military efficiency, disarming mercenaries, checking bodies, establishing perimeter. One was already on the phone with emergency services. Liora held Marcus as his blood soaked through her nanny uniform, as his eyes began to drift unfocused. "Tell me," he whispered, his voice fading. "Did you see it? The checkmate? Before Victor?" "Yes," she said through tears. 7 moves. I had you." Marcus's laugh was wet, painful, beautiful. "I know. I saw it too. You won, Liora. You beat the devil." "Don't you dare use past tense," she commanded, her voice breaking. "Stay alive. That's an order." The last thing Marcus saw before consciousness slipped away was Leora's face above him. Exhausted, terrified, covered in blood and tears, but fierce, so fierce, refusing to let him die. The paramedics arrived 8 minutes later. Marcus was rushed to a trauma center with Liora and Giovanni following in a separate vehicle. The study was left destroyed. A war zone of overturned furniture, scattered chess pieces, bullet holes in the walls, and blood on the Persian carpets Marcus had joked about. But in all the debris, one chess piece remained standing upright on the floor where it had fallen during the chaos. The White Queen, Leora's queen, still standing after everything. 3 weeks crawled by like 3 years. The private hospital room overlooking Manhattan was beautiful in that sterile, expensive way that hospitals pretend not to be hospitals. Floor-to-ceiling windows, comfortable chairs, art on the walls that cost more than most people made in a year. Marcus had survived 3 surgeries. The bullets had torn through his abdomen, nicked his liver, and come within millimeters of his spine. The surgeon had told Liora, who had no legal right to that information but whom the staff didn't dare refuse, that it was a miracle he'd lived. Anyone else would have bled out before the ambulance arrived, the surgeon had said. But Mr. Valero is exceptionally determined. Liora visited every day. She'd sit by his bedside reading newspapers to him, helping him eat when he was strong enough, changing bandages with gentle efficiency she'd learned caring for 7-year-old Sophia's scraped knees. Giovanni had entered a 90-day rehabilitation program that Marcus had arranged and paid for before the shooting. One of his last acts before the federal prosecutors had frozen his assets. The facility was upstate, expensive and private, the kind of place that actually had success rates instead of just warehousing addicts. "I'm doing this for you, Piccola," Giovanni had told her the day he checked in, tears in his eyes. "And for your mother." And for myself, I'm done running. So now Liora sat alone by Marcus's bedside most days, and their relationship transformed into something neither of them had expected. Not captor and captive anymore. Not criminal and victim. Just two survivors learning how to trust. Marcus told her everything, about the testimony he'd agreed to give to federal prosecutors, about the plea deal that would dismantle his empire but keep him out of prison. He'd be entering witness protection, receiving a new identity, starting over somewhere far from New York. I'm burning it all down, he told her one afternoon, his voice still weak but growing stronger. The shipping company, the clubs, the underground operations, every business Antonio built. All of it. The feds are going to use my testimony to destroy the Bratva, the Chinese syndicates, everyone. And then what? Liora asked, setting down the newspaper. Who are you when you're not the devil of New York? Marcus admitted he didn't know. I'm terrified to find out. But I think. He paused, choosing words carefully. I'd like to try being someone else. Someone who doesn't solve problems with bullets. They talked about futures, where Liora would go when Giovanni finished rehab, whether she'd stay in New York or return to Italy, what she'd do with the money Marcus had insisted on giving her from his remaining unfrozen accounts. The conversations were careful, both of them dancing around deeper feelings neither knew how to express. Both of them knowing that their time was limited, that witness protection meant Marcus would vanish into a new life, that they'd probably never see each other again. And then, 3 weeks and 2 days after the shooting, Liora stood up abruptly during one of their afternoon visits. I need to tell you something, she said. Marcus, still pale but healing, looked at her with concern. What's wrong? I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air like a chess piece suspended mid-move. Marcus stared at her, speechless for the first time since she'd met him. Liora continued quickly, the words tumbling out. 8 weeks. I found out last week. Remember the night before the chess match? When you found me in the garden crying about Papa. When we... She couldn't finish the sentence. They'd shared one night together before the game. One moment of unexpected intimacy when Marcus had found her sobbing under the stars, and instead of mocking her weakness, he'd sat beside her in silence. And then somehow, neither of them quite knowing how it happened, they'd ended up in his bedroom, two broken people seeking comfort in the only way that made sense. It had been brief, intense. Neither had spoken about it since. I'm not asking you for anything, Liora said, her voice stronger now. You're going into witness protection. New identity, new life. I just thought you deserved to know. Papa and I are going back to Italy when he finishes rehab. I'll raise the baby there. You don't have to. Marry me, Marcus interrupted. Liora stopped mid-sentence. What? Marcus struggled to sit up straighter despite the pain in his abdomen. Marry me, he repeated. You're insane, Liora said, but her voice was shaking. We barely know each other. This is trauma bonding. This is. Probably, Marcus agreed. But I don't care. Listen to me, Liora. I'm not asking because of obligation. Not because of the baby. Not because of debt or danger or any of the reasons people like us usually make terrible decisions. He reached for her hand. Marry me because in that study, when Victor had a gun to your head, you looked at me and said, trust. And I did. Because you're the only person who ever beat me at the only thing I love. Because you saw who I really am, the monster, the murderer, all of it, and you didn't run. You stayed. You held me while I bled out on that floor and told me to stay alive, and I did. Because you told me to. Liora's tears were flowing freely now. I'm choosing something besides violence for the first time in my life, Marcus said. I'm choosing you. If you'll have me. Liora looked at this dangerous, damaged, impossible man who'd kidnapped her father and forced her into a death game, and then taken bullets protecting her and somehow become the father of her unborn child. She thought about cycles. About her mother, killed by Antonio Valero. About her father, destroyed by addiction. About choosing differently. Ask me again in 6 months, she said finally. When you're out of this hospital. When Papa is out of rehab. When you've actually dismantled your empire and kept your promises to the prosecutors. Ask me when we're not surrounded by blood and trauma and fear. If you still want us, then ask me again. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding. 6 months. I can do 6 months. Liora leaned down and kissed his forehead gently. Then I'll see you in 6 months, Marcus Valero. Try not to die before then. 6 months later, on a sunny afternoon in Milan, Liora walked through the Parco Sempione pushing a stroller. Her daughter Isabella, Bella for short, was 3 months old with dark hair and gray eyes that looked exactly like her father's. Giovanni walked beside her, genuinely sober for the first time in a decade. He was teaching chess at a community center 3 days a week, working with kids from poor neighborhoods, passing on the gift that had saved him and destroyed him and saved him again. She has your intelligence, Giovanni said, looking at his granddaughter. I can see it in her eyes. She'll be brilliant. Or she'll be a doctor, Liora said. Or an artist. Or anything she wants. No pressure. Liora had started singing again, not chess but opera. The music her mother had loved. She performed at small venues, wedding celebrations, local theaters. Remembering joy her mother had taught her before the fire took everything. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Piazza del Duomo. Noon tomorrow. I have a question to ask. Liora's heart stopped. She knew immediately who it was. The next day, she stood in the Piazza del Duomo with Bella in a carrier against her chest. Milan's magnificent cathedral rose behind her, all Gothic spires and marble magnificence. And then she saw him. Marcus Valero crossed the plaza slowly, and he looked different. Clean-shaven. Simple jeans and a button-down shirt instead of expensive suits. No bodyguards. No weapons. No tattoos visible. He'd had them covered with more ink, transforming the violent symbols into something beautiful. He looked lighter, younger, like someone who'd learned how to breathe. You came, he said. You asked, she replied. They stood awkwardly. This man and woman who'd survived war together, who'd created life together, who barely knew each other outside of violence and fear. Marcus looked at the baby. She's beautiful. She has your eyes. And your stubborn jaw, Liora added. Fair warning. She doesn't sleep through the night. I can handle that, Marcus said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a white chess queen, carved from ivory, one of the pieces from their game. I went back to the estate before the federal seizure, he explained. Found this in the debris. It was still standing after everything, bullets, blood, betrayal. It survived. He got down on one knee in the middle of the Piazza del Duomo. Tourists flowed around them. Locals walked past with shopping bags. The world continued indifferent. Liora Marchetti, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the stone plaza. I don't have an empire anymore. I don't have money or power or anything I used to think mattered. I have a new name, a boring one, you'll hate it. I have a job teaching mathematics at a high school in Tuscany, which is as far from organized crime as I could get. I have a chance to be something other than my uncle's monster. He held up the white queen. I'm asking you, will you teach me how to be human? Will you let me be a father to our daughter? Will you marry me, not because you have to, not because of obligation or fear, but because you choose to? Liora looked down at him. This man who'd held her father hostage, who'd nearly killed them all, who'd also dismantled his entire world for a chance at redemption. She thought about her mother, about cycles, about choosing differently. One condition, she said. Anything. We finish our chess game. The one victor interrupted. Not here but somewhere safe. And we play it honestly this time. No stakes. No violence. Just the game. Just us. Marcus stood, hope lighting his entire face. And if you checkmate me? Liora smiled through tears. Then you spend the rest of your life letting me win. Deal, Marcus whispered. He pulled her into an embrace, careful of the baby between them, gentle in a way she'd never seen him be gentle, and they stood there in the Milan sunshine. Two broken people choosing to build something whole. 1 year later, a small apartment in Milan's Navigli district. Evening light streamed through windows overlooking the canal. The smell of Leora's cooking, her mother's recipe for risotto, filled the air. Liora and Marcus sat at a simple wooden table. Between them, the chessboard from the estate. Marcus had bought it at the federal auction for $200, outbidding collectors who had no idea what game had been played on its surface. The position was exactly where they'd left it that terrible night. Move 70. Liora one move away from beginning her checkmate sequence. They'd kept it frozen for over a year, neither willing to end it. Baby Isabella, now 15 months old, played on a blanket nearby, stacking colorful blocks with fierce concentration that made Liora laugh. Giovanni sat in an armchair, 18 months sober, visiting for Sunday dinner. He'd published a book, The Phantom's Redemption, a chess master's journey through hell and back. It was selling well. He donated all proceeds to addiction recovery programs. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked. "Are you?" Liora countered. She moved her queen to G7, the killing square, the beginning of the end. Marcus studied the board with the concentration of a man who'd spent his childhood memorizing grandmaster games. He saw the sequence, the inevitable 7-move checkmate that had been waiting all this time. He could resign right now, tip his king over, end it. Instead, he played out every move, making her earn the victory, playing the best defense possible even though he knew they both knew how it would end. 7 moves later, Leora's rook and queen coordinated for the final blow. Her king stood triumphant on the 6th rank. Marcus's king had nowhere to run. "Checkmate," Liora said softly. Marcus tipped his king over in surrender, the ancient gesture of defeat. They sat in silence, the completed game between them after all this time. "Thank you," Marcus said finally. "For what?" "For finishing it. For not running when you could have. For teaching me that losing doesn't mean dying." Liora reached across the table and took his hand, the hand that had once held a gun to kill her, that now changed their daughter's diapers and cooked breakfast on Saturdays. "We both won, Marcus. We're both still here." Giovanni looked up from his newspaper, watching his daughter and her husband, his granddaughter babbling happily in her own private language. He remembered teaching young Liora in their Milan kitchen, never imagining where those lessons would lead. "Papa," Liora called to him, "come teach Bella the names of the pieces." Giovanni joined them at the table, picking up the fallen white king, the piece that had surrendered, and holding it out to the baby's tiny reaching hands. "This is the king, Piccola," he said to his granddaughter. "The most important piece. But you know what? He's also the weakest. He can only move 1 square at a time. You want to know the real secret of chess?" Bella looked at him with those serious gray eyes. "The queen is the most powerful piece on the board. She can move anywhere, do anything, save everyone. Remember that when you're older. Remember that sometimes the world will try to make you feel like a pawn. But you have the power of a queen inside you. Your mama taught me that." Outside, Milan's evening bells rang across the city. Inside, a family sat together playing chess, not for survival but for joy. Marcus reset the board, pieces in starting position, ready for a new game. "Your move," he said to Liora. "No," she replied, guiding Bella's small hand to a white pawn. "Her move. We teach her together." And so they did, 2 former enemies teaching their daughter that strategy isn't about destruction. It's about protecting the ones you love. It's about seeing 20 moves ahead and choosing, every single time, to build instead of break. The final image, 3 generations around a chessboard. Giovanni, the Phantom of Milan, broken and rebuilt. Liora, the invisible nanny who became a queen. Marcus, the devil of New York who learned to be human. And Isabella, the next generation, born from violence, raised with love, holding a white pawn in her tiny hand. Outside, the world continued. Inside, they'd found checkmate against their pasts and discovered that the best move of all was the one that led to forgiveness. The game was over. The real life was just beginning. So what do you think? Could you ever forgive someone who'd done terrible things if they genuinely changed? Could Liora and Marcus really build a life together? Or are some wounds too deep to heal? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you think about redemption and second chances. Thank you for watching and listening to this story. If it moved you, if you felt that tension, if you were rooting for them even when you knew you shouldn't be, hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And turn on notifications because we're bringing you more stories like this every week. Stories about impossible choices, hidden strength, and the truth that sometimes the most powerful move is the one nobody sees coming. Until next time, remember, we're all playing a game. Make sure you're playing for the right stakes.